Classical Special. We're here interviewing Cha-Ching, Sir Williams II, and Muhammad Ali. We've interviewed these two men in regards to the architecture, art, and sculpture of the post-classical period. Although Byzantine, medieval, Islamic, Indian, and Chinese are mostly different in many aspects of culture, they have similarities in aspects of various types of architecture and sculpture. Now, to get us started in this post-classical art, architecture, and sculpture, we have in for us Cha-Ching. Cha-Ching will be here to compare India and China in the arts of regards to paintings. Now let's get this interview started. Cha, what is a main difference when examining both the Indian and Chinese arts?
Well, Matt, one main difference between my ethnicity's art and India's is the substantial amount of religion displayed in India's style of art. In many instances, such as the famous illustrations of Muar and Malvar, art in India is strongly devoted towards gods, such as Krishna and basically other worldly situations. Also, in the Vijayanagar era, they created illuminated manuscripts for religious purposes, whereas China did not do that in any way. Our art depicts mostly landscapes and people at work and is very of this world type of art. The popularity in landscape painting came to be in the Tang Dynasty and really stuck with us.
So, are there any more differences that stand out to you?
Let me think. Here's one. China likes to keep all their colors subtle and almost monochrome. We only include a touch here and there of slight watercolor. We don't like to get into large extravagance in our arts, and we keep everything very calm. On the other hand, Indian art contains many colors and an enormous extravagance in most of their arts. For example, in the Vijayanagar era of Indian painting, colors may not have been in a great multitude, but many different shades of colors were seen.
So, can you come up with any similarities between yours and Indian painting?
This is a tough one. Now that I think about it, looking back at my answer to the first question, we both give a strong consideration to our religions when putting our ideas onto a canvas. We both get a great amount of inspiration from Hinduism, Indian art gets a great amount of inspiration from Hinduism, and we get ours from either Buddhism or Confucianism. Although we gather very different messages from our religions and have very different beliefs, we find power in using those religions to get our ideas into the material world.
It's very interesting, Shaw. Never thought about the two religions that way. Are there more similarities that you can think of?
There is one more. Indian art does incorporate some nature into the art, just as we do. Although they do incorporate some nature into their paintings, but it's webbed into some of the art, such as wispy trees surrounding young maidens in the form of devotion to gods, whereas Chinese art is strictly nature and not as extravagant representations of nature. Also, we both like to use a method of fresco painting, which is basically a type of watercolor. We've been using fresco painting for a longer period of time than Indians, however. The Indians started using this in the 16th and 17th centuries in Hindu or Orissa, but we started way back in the Tang Dynasty when Wang Wei discovered it.
Now, Cha, are there any more comparisons that you would like to add for my closing question?
Let's see. There is a comparison and contrast that I can think of when referring to Indian and Chinese art. Both Indian and Chinese included great precision in many of their works, which is the similarity. I can't recall any examples of precision in Chinese art at the moment, but I do know India greatly resembles this description in the Gujarat era, located in their illuminated manuscripts. Beyond that, Chinese art also includes a form of impressionism that isn't included in a majority, if not all, of India's art. This impressionism is mostly seen in their landscape paintings, which adds to its beauty and breathtaking scenery.
Last question, Cha. If you were to bet on Chinese art or Indian art in a competition in terms of pure beauty, who would win?
Matt, this is the easiest question you've asked all interview. I bet you know the answer to this one, don't you? Chinese art will be Indian anytime, any day. We simply have more elegance and serenity in all of our art. We value strong focus and morality in every single one of our pieces of art, strongly outweighing that of India's. India's art is simply too overwhelming and is all over the place. While it may be pretty, it is not beautiful. Matt, they don't call me Cha-Ching for nothing.
Now that does it for Cha. Thank you, Cha. Let's continue now with Sir William VII to compare the architecture of both the medieval and Byzantine eras. Now we welcome Sir William VII. We are here to interview him about the post-classical architecture about the Byzantine and medieval eras. How do the Byzantine and medieval relate?
Well, their architecture they're fairly similar with the facts that they both have big spires. They both aspired for very large building using high towers. It's where you get the more castle designed buildings rather than the huts that they formerly lived in.
So what is medieval art exactly?
Medieval art was Romanesque, and it also started the Gothic style of architecture, where you have the big grand spires of the churches with the gargoyles on them and sculptures in them. Also, they had the flying buttresses alongside the buildings. And it really just, medieval art and architecture really started the grand sense of building.
So can you expand on Byzantine architecture a little bit?
Byzantine architecture didn't really have its own style. It very closely resembled just Roman architecture, again, Romanesque, and that's where the medieval and Byzantine architecture really formed close together. But Byzantine slowly evolved into its own kind of style of architecture, adapting from the Islamic architecture, also from the medieval architecture.
Also, how did Romanesque influence the buildings during this period?
The buildings themselves became the art. The buildings were built up, and then they also had sculptures put into them that really brought out the beauty of the buildings themselves.
So, finally, for my last question, how do the sculptures increase the beauty of the buildings?
The sculptures were carved into the ugly parts of the buildings to bring out the blandness of the buildings, to kind of remove it and make it look very pretty. You'd have columns with large people carved into them, you'd have buttresses with many designs onto them, and you'd have stained glass windows more frequently.
Hello, this is Cha-Ching again, now with just a little more ching. You may remember me from earlier, but now I am, instead of the interviewee, the interviewer. I will be interviewing Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, about the post-classical sculpture of Byzantine and Islamic. Muhammad, how are the Byzantine and Islamic compared?
Byzantine sculptures were fundamentally based on the incorporation of Christian themes into Greek humanism and naturalism. Together, these concepts symbolized and reflected divinity. Man and nature were seen as the image of the divine. The new figurative type of sculpting was not seeking the aesthetic per se in the Greek tradition, but striving to translate concepts in Christian belief such as salvation and sacrifice.
Interesting. What are the main elements of Islamic sculpting?
Islamic sculpting is not the type of a particular country or particular people. It is the sculpting of civilization formed by a combination of historical circumstances, the conquest of the ancient world by the Arabs, the enforced unification of a vast territory under the banner of Islam, a territory which was in turn invaded by various groups of alien peoples. From the start, the direction of Islamic sculpting was largely determined by political sculptures which cut across geographical and sociological boundaries.
What are some types of Islamic sculptures, and why isn't there a lot?
Unlike in Western traditions, the Islamic world sculpture is a minor art form. Because of the Quran's ban and idols of the hadiths against figural representation, what sculpture one found in Islamic art in previous centuries was usually small and portable, made of glass or metal. In the contemporary world, Muslim artists feel free to create sculpture, but the opposition against sculptural representation in certain factions of Islam remains intense.
And now that does it for sculpting in the post-classical era between Byzantine and Islamic with Muhammad Ali.
That concludes this episode of the post-classical era. Special thanks to Cha Ching, Muhammad Ali, and Sir William VII. Also, special thanks to Wikipedia, Wiki Answers, and Yahoo Answers for all the help they've provided with us. Next time we will examine the industrial era and how it all started. We hope this was educational and improved your knowledge on the various cultures of the Eastern Hemisphere during post-classical times. That's all, folks.
That's all, folks.